In April 1991, a package arrived at the Greene County Sheriff's Office in southwest Missouri. No return address. No note. Inside was a human skull. For 10 years, nobody could say whose it was. Somewhere out there, a family was still waiting for a phone call that never came. A husband. 2 young children. A woman who was 7 months pregnant when she vanished, 3 years before that skull turned up in the mail. Whoever sent it knew something. They knew exactly where to look. A crevice in the Ozark Hills in country most people would never think to search. And then they let that knowledge travel through the U.S. Postal Service, to strangers in a plain box. And disappeared. It would take federal marshals, 3 states, and 38 years for the investigation to catch up to what that box already knew. The case started with silence. It restarted with a box left on a desk. Somebody knew who this was. The question that would take Christian County, Missouri almost 4 decades to answer was simple. Who? This case took 38 years to reach a courtroom. We're going to walk through exactly how, the evidence, the years it sat cold, and the record that finally changed things. If you want to follow investigations like this one as they develop, subscribe now because we'll be covering this trial as it moves forward. That skull, it turned out, belonged to a 22-year-old woman named Ronna Bremer. In December of 1988, she was living just outside Ozark, Missouri with her husband, Joel, and their 2 children, 3 years old and 1 year old. She was 7 months pregnant with a third. There's not a lot of public record about who Ronna was outside of that. She was a stay-at-home mom. Young. Her days would have looked like most young mothers' days in a small Missouri town in the late 80s. 2 kids under 4, a third on the way, a household to run. Her sister, Deanna, is still alive, still carries this. She's talked about what it was like for their parents to find out what happened to her, the kind of sound a parent makes when they hear something like that. Deanna's word for it was guttural. That's most of what we have. And that's worth sitting with for a second because it's easy in a case like this to let the missing person become a mystery first and a person second. Ronna was a person first. A mother of 2 expecting a third, 22 years old. Whatever else this case turns out to be about, it starts there. 3 years after she disappeared, that unmarked skull showed up at the Greene County Sheriff's Office. It sat there for another decade before anyone could confirm whose it was. In 2001, testing finally identified it as Ronna's. So now the case has a name. What it still didn't have in 1988 was an explanation. Here's what we know about the last night anyone reported having contact with her. On the night of December 20, 1988, Joel Bremer says he and Ronna got into an argument. According to his account, he left the house on foot. He says his plan was to walk to his workplace and wait outside until it opened the next morning so he could pick up his paycheck. But it was December in the Ozarks and he says he got too cold to wait it out. So he turned around and went home. By his account, he came back into the house, found it quiet, and fell asleep in the living room with his 2 kids. He says he didn't realize Ronna was gone until the next morning. There's one other piece to that night. Joel's sister, Barbara Gray, told investigators that Ronna called her around 10:30 that evening. What they talked about isn't part of the public record. That's the whole account of December 20, 1988, as it's been told. An argument. A walk in the cold. A phone call to a sister-in-law. A man asleep on his living room floor with his children, waking up to find his wife gone. 2 days later, on December 22nd, Joel reported Ronna missing. And for the moment, that's where the story sat. One man's version of one night, and no one else in the room to say otherwise. It would be 2 years before anyone found a reason to look closer. The skull that was mailed to the sheriff's office in 1991, the one confirmed 9 years later as Ronna's, wasn't found in some anonymous stretch of woods. It was found in a crevice on land connected to David Gray, Joel's brother-in-law. That detail alone would have been enough to put Gray's name in the file. But there's more. In 2001, the same year the skull was finally identified, a new witness came forward. This person told investigators that David Gray had confessed to them directly. According to this account, Gray described choking a woman to death in his car. The witness recalled Gray's own words, that he'd had to choke her twice because, in Gray's telling, she wouldn't die the first time. That's a specific, disturbing claim, tied to a specific piece of geography where Ronna's remains turned up. For anyone looking at this case from the outside, it's hard not to draw a straight line. So the question at this point is a fair one to ask. Was this it? Was this the break that finally explained what happened to Ronna Bremer? It wasn't. Not in any way that led anywhere. And that, on its own, is worth sitting with before we go further. Whatever the Gray lead was worth, it didn't move the case forward. Neither did anything else for a long time. In 2002, the Christian County Sheriff at the time, Joey Matlock, told a reporter they had suspects and believed they were looking at a murder. "It's a priority with us," he said. No one was arrested. The case got picked back up in 2016. More interviews were conducted. It went cold again. By the time Sheriff Brad Cole talks about this case on camera, decades later, he doesn't try to dress up what happened in between. He says there just wasn't much to work with, not a lot of information, not much anyone could physically point to. He says Joel Bremer had been a person of interest through most of that time. And when he's asked why, with all of that, nobody brought charges for over 30 years, he doesn't have a clean answer. He says he can't tell you why previous investigators didn't get there. That's a striking thing to hear a sitting sheriff say about his own department's history with a case. Not an excuse. Just an acknowledgement that something didn't happen that maybe should have. So the real question by this point isn't really, who did this? Investigators had a person of interest the whole time. The question is what they were missing, or what they'd missed looking at. It turned out to be sitting in a filing cabinet in another state. In November of 2024, Christian County detectives reopened the case again, this time with help from a documentary production team, which is its own strange footnote to this story. They traveled to Iowa, to Nebraska. They went back through old interviews and conducted new ones. And somewhere in that process, they found something that had been sitting untouched for decades, an arrest report out of Oskaloosa, Iowa. It showed that Joel Bremer had been arrested there for domestic assault against Rana, back when the two of them were living in that state. That record predates her disappearance. It had been there the whole time. Nobody had connected it to the case until 2024. When prosecutors eventually filed charges, they wrote that Joel Bremer had a documented history of domestic violence against Rana. That's their characterization laid out in charging documents. It's an allegation prosecutors are required to prove, not an established fact. But it's worth pointing out what else was already on the record by then. Joel Bremer had pleaded guilty back in 2001 to 2 felony counts of sexual abuse in an unrelated case. He served 7 years for it. That conviction happened around the same stretch of time investigators were finally confirming that the skull mailed to them a decade earlier was his wife's. None of that, on its own, tells you what happened on December 20, 1988. But it does something to how you read the rest of this case. For years, the file had a name attached to a second-hand confession and a stretch of woods, David Gray. What it didn't have until 2024 was this, a documented pattern involving the one person who was in the house that night. The question investigators were left with wasn't whether Joel Bremer had a history. That part the record settled. The question was whether it was enough, finally, to charge him with something they'd suspected for over 3 decades. There's one more piece to the 2024 breakthrough, and it's the one that's hardest to talk about because we genuinely don't know all of it yet. Back in 1989, investigators had collected a piece of evidence in connection with Rana's disappearance. In 2024, that evidence was sent to a lab and tested again, this time with DNA technology that simply didn't exist when it was first collected. That testing produced a usable DNA profile. What that profile shows specifically, whose DNA it is, what it proves, hasn't been made public. Authorities have said it will be presented at trial. So we're not going to speculate on it here. That's a piece of this story that isn't finished yet, and it wouldn't be honest to pretend otherwise. What we do know is that between the DNA work, the Iowa arrest record, and months of interviews across 3 states, Christian County investigators put together enough to take to the prosecutor's office. On July 24, 2026, a Christian County grand jury indicted Joel Bremer. 2 counts of second-degree murder, one for Rana and one for their unborn child. By then, Joel Bremer wasn't living in Christian County anymore. He'd relocated to the Kansas City area, where he'd been running a barbecue restaurant. It closed in 2025, so the case had an indictment. What it didn't have yet was the man himself. On July 31, 2026, a week after the indictment, the U.S. Marshals Service arrested Joel Bremer in Kansas City. He was brought back to Christian County. He appeared in court that Monday morning. The judge set his bond at $200,000. That's it. That's the arrest. There's no confrontation, no chase, just a warrant finally catching up to a man who'd been living a few hours up the highway, running a barbecue restaurant that closed the year before. 38 years is a long time for a case to sit open. It's also a long time for a life to keep going. Joel Bremer got divorced from Rana in absentia, while she was still officially a missing person. He served a prison sentence for an unrelated crime. He moved. He remarried or didn't, the record doesn't say. He ran a business. All of that happened while this file sat at various points, active, cold, reopened, and cold again. Now there's a courtroom in his future. What happens there we don't know yet. We're not going to guess at it. He's been charged. He hasn't been convicted. That distinction matters, and it's going to matter for however long this takes to resolve. What we can say is that after almost 4 decades, there's finally a hearing date on a calendar somewhere. For the people who've been waiting the longest, that alone is not nothing. There's a version of this story that ends with the arrest. That's not where we're going to leave it. Ronna Bremer had a sister, Deanna Stevens, who is still around to talk about her. Deanna remembers what it was like when their parents found out what had happened. She's described it as a sound, not words. Something guttural. That's the word she used. It's not a detail from a police report. It's a memory that's been sitting inside a family for a long time. Ronna also had 2 children. They were 3 and 1 years old when she disappeared. They grew up. Whatever their lives have looked like since, they grew up without her, and without an answer for most of that time. When Sheriff Cole talks about this case now, he doesn't frame it as a triumph of forensic science, even though the science mattered. He talks about the family. He said that even though nothing can bring Ronna back, this might be what her children and the rest of her family needed to finally get some peace. That's really what this case has been about, underneath the investigation. A family that didn't get to grieve normally because grieving usually comes with knowing what happened. They didn't have that. For 38 years they had a missing woman, then a skull with no name, then a name with no explanation, then a suspect with no charges. Now they have an indictment. They don't have a verdict. As of this filming, Joel Bremer is presumed innocent. He's awaiting trial. What actually happened in that house on the night of December 20th, 1988, is a question that now belongs to a jury, not to us and not yet to history. What it took to get even this far is worth sitting with. 38 years. A mailed skull. An overlooked arrest record. A documentary crew that ended up part of the investigation itself. And a family that is still, after all of it, waiting to find out if any of this adds up to justice. This case isn't finished. There's a trial still ahead, and what's presented there may change parts of what we know today. We'll be following it and reporting what actually happens in that courtroom. Not speculation, just what's confirmed. Subscribe if you want that update when it comes. And if you have information about this case or any unsolved case in your community, contact your local sheriff's office or the Christian County Sheriff's Office directly. Cases like this one got answered because someone, eventually, said something.